Afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait about 30 more seconds to let folks come in, but welcome to our Big Ideas in Education session. Happy you're here. So we'll go ahead and get ready because we only have an hour and really want to save as much time as we have for our panelists to talk and for us to engage in a lively conversation today. This is like a lunchtime session. And so hopefully everyone out there has some coffee or some treats or something that you can sit back and enjoy our conversation. I'm Cheryl Holcomb-McCoy, Dean of the School of Education at American University, and welcome to our Big Ideas in Education series. As many of you know, this series is a means for us in our School of Education community to learn from some of the best leaders and innovative thinkers in education. And particularly as we embark on our school's journey to creating an anti-racist learning community, this series has really been a benchmark or a real way for us to learn even more about how to really achieve our journey of becoming, how to achieve our goals of becoming an anti-racist school of education. Today, we are pleased to welcome a brilliant panel of experts from diverse education settings to discuss a topic that, as I said, is core to our value system here in the school. Last week, we had Dr. Carrie Ann Askai from the University of Nebraska, and she gave a talk on anti-racism in early childhood education. And today, we will hear from three educators who have engaged in anti-racist work in three separate settings and from what I call with three different lenses. We are so happy to have Dr. Arelis Diaz, who's a program officer for the Office of the President at the Kellogg Foundation. And Dr. Diaz has led PK-12 education strategy at Kellogg for states such as New Mexico and Mississippi. And she has notable accomplishments in forming collaborative partnerships to address equity, cultural, and linguistic needs in teacher preparation. I really look forward to hearing about some of that work that she has been engaged in for many years. We also have with us Dr. Bren Elliott, who is joining us from our partner district, the District of Columbia Public Schools, DCPS, where she serves as the Chief of School Improvement and Supports. Before coming to DCPS, Dr. Elliott served as Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services for Wake County Public Schools in North Carolina. And she's also spent 15 years working as an educator in Nashville, Tennessee. And while in Nashville, she was an area director, a high school principal, a middle school principal, and a high school teacher. So we're really looking forward to hearing all of her thoughts about anti-racist practice and education from those various roles that she's played in at the district level and at the school level. And last but not least, we have our very own scholar in residence at American University School of Education, Dr. Andre Perry, who is a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. He is a columnist for the Hechinger Report and the author of the book Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Prior to his work at Brookings, Dr. Perry was a founding dean and also a professor. And Dr. Perry has served on an expert panel with us here at the American University School of Education as we work to conceptualize anti-racist teacher preparation. So I want to say welcome to all three of our guests. Just so happy to have you here with us at our virtual School of Education. Looking forward to learning from you today. Before we jump in, however, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I want to mention to our audience. There is no chat feature today. You will see a Q&A feature that you can put some questions in. We do have questions from some of our audience members that were gathered at the time of registration. Our event will be recorded and available on our YouTube page, our School of Education YouTube page. So please let your friends and colleagues know that they can also chime in and hear the panel discussion at a later time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to go to our panelists and welcome again. I'm so happy you are here. And, you know, I think I talked a lot about anti-racism in my introduction. So I think, first of all, it would be very helpful if we could talk a little bit about defining anti-racism, because I think that is often, we assume that the audience knows what we're talking about when we use that terminology. And I would like just to hear from you. How do you define anti-racism work in education? What does that really mean? And how is it different from, for instance, culturally responsive teaching or culturally responsive education, multicultural education? We've heard that for many years. How do you define anti-racism and how is it different from these other terms? And anyone can go.
Yeah, I'll start. I do a lot of work on policy at the Brookings Institution. And for me, when anti-racism really became in vogue, for me, it has always meant to have proactively weed racist structures or systems that create racist outcomes from the current environment and replace them with structures and practices that encourage inclusion. So often when we talk about multiculturalism, we sort of accept the rules of the game as given. But using an anti-racist frame, you don't accept the rules of the game. You say that we need to change the structures to produce different outcomes. And whether that's structured around teaching, around financing, around transportation, all of these things have, you see the vestiges of discrimination, the vestiges of segregation in them. And so we need to replace those systems and replace them with ones that encourage inclusion. So that's how I define it.
Right. So it really is disrupting the norm and the policies that have been in place for so long, whereas possibly multicultural educational, culturally responsive work has worked within these structures to try to change. And so now we're saying, let's change the structures, right?
That's right.
Okay. What do you think, others?
I can go next. I would absolutely echo Dr. Perry. I would add that anti-racist education and educators include histories from all the cultures and languages represented in our communities, that these educators value the importance of culture and how to effectively use culture to promote social justice in the classrooms and in their buildings and in their districts. I really value those that elevate the stories of resistance versus oppression, how people resisted slavery versus the typical Underground Railroad history lessons, as just to make it real practical, of liberation, justice for migrant workers, telling stories that promote people like our undocumented families and their immigration status, but stories that activate through social change and civic engagement, like the census work, every vote counts, imagining the idea of amplification of new messages in the classroom is what an anti-racist educator commits to talking about who benefited from these stories that we tell in the classroom and who didn't, to enhance that with music and art and respecting those types of cultural components of a child and the students that we serve is what creates an anti-racist classroom and educator. And that is what we ultimately want to create the sense of belonging for every student in the classroom and in our buildings and in our districts. That's what I would challenge every educator listening to this panel today. Commit yourself today to be an equity lever and a change agent, right? Stop and rethink what you want to be as an educator. Move from being a passive educator, we have too many of those, to a brave educator that fully understands the commitment and the definition of anti-racist educator, to force themselves to see the humanity that we share with our students, and then to learn about the students and their families, to understand their wholeness, and then to be able to say, I want to create a classroom that tells stories, to recognize the humanity between us. And in that vulnerability of sharing stories, we heal. And that's part of being an anti-racist educator, because racism is a sickness, and their stories will heal us from this sickness. Then we can be dedicated, every ounce of our being, to creating a classroom that is fully belonging, where every student feels like they belong. And then that will create the most effective teacher and the most successful students.
I like that terminology of racism as a sickness.
Mm-hmm.
And I would even say that it's a contagious sickness, that you can catch it, right? And it doesn't just stay with you, it can be spread over. That's pretty powerful. Dr. Elliott, do you have, what are your thoughts about anti-racism? Because I know in DCPS, you are really putting forth a very strong anti-racist, you're taking a very strong anti-racist stance. So what are your thoughts? How are you all defining it?
Yes, so, we are thinking about what is the intentional action that we take to disrupt systemic racism and bias that exist in structures and systems in our school district. And so to me, that is the real anti-racist work. For us, it does include mindset work. So the work that we need to do to give people a good understanding of the impact of race and racism in America, and how that is embedded in the DNA of our country, and how that creates these inequitable opportunities for our students and their families. And so how do we disrupt that? How do we examine our data from any outcome that we have to see if there is disproportionality in outcomes when we disaggregate it by race? And then what is the intentional actions that we do to disrupt those trends that we see? So it is really about the action. Again, mindset shifts are important, but policies and practice are essential to the work that we do. And we believe that that work has to happen both at an individual level as well as a systemic level. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to, there was one thing that I neglected to say that I think Dr. Diaz and Dr. Elliott jogged in my memory, is that so much of education has been about fixing children, fixing parents, and even fixing teachers. And anti-racist perspectives, it says to ask, why are these outcomes here? And you stop then trying to fix people. I say all the time that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That you begin to start looking at root causes, and those root causes are often from racist elements or conditions. And so I think it is really a mind shift in saying, we're trained to say, let's fix this student, let's pour knowledge into this kid's head, and not necessarily look at the systems that are creating these outcomes. So it's a shift that many of us were trained in a much different way. And so I think having us look at systems and stop blaming children and parents, that's an element of anti-racism.
Absolutely. And I would say that, certainly implementing culturally responsive pedagogy and curriculum could be a strategy that an anti-racist educator uses. But when I think about an anti-racist educator, it's a person that is really thinking about how do I disrupt these practices that lead to racialized outcomes. With race being a social construct. So, our end game is how do we ensure that our outcomes are not predictable by any social.
We lost. We're losing you a bit, Brenda. Dr. Elliott. I think I know what she's saying, though, that we shouldn't be able to predict the outcomes of students.
And then I think at that point we know. Or yeah. So can you hear me again now?
We hear you now. Yeah.
Am I back?
Yes,
you are. Good.
Okay. So, yeah, I think the gist of that. Okay, so the gist of that is that, that you're not able to predict any outcome by a social construct, with race being a social construct. So how do we interrupt those things that lead to those predictable outcomes for our students?
Right. So, I think that's a good segue into this notion of, then we know what anti-racism is and what the goal is, but then how do you change the hearts and minds, the mindsets of people? And so when we think about training practices and anti-racism, is it relearning some of those narratives that we've been taught our entire lives, right? So it's those internal narratives about people and groups. How do you think how do we do that? Because I think that's why it is so difficult for some. First of all, changing systems is difficult for some because we rely on these systems and structures for everything, to tell us, what do we do next? Grading structures, policies around discipline. But to change the hearts and minds of teachers, how do you do that? Or of educators in general, just not teachers? What would you tell someone if they're starting on this journey, like we are in the School of Education? How do we do that? What are some of your big ideas related to that?
I have two things in mind. One, from a curriculum standpoint, we've all been taught bad history.
I'd say we want to.
Hold on, Brent. Dr. Elliott, hold on. Go ahead and finish, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, we've all learned racist history. And so part of this process is to address the real achievement gap. And that's in understanding history. That so many people just don't know about slavery, about Reconstruction, things like redlining, segregation, and that helped develop the systems that we have. And so when you think about how schools are financed, it is a direct result of segregation and housing segregation, and an effort to say, hey, I don't want to really have a public education. I only want my kids to be educated in a certain way. But that really comes from, an ignorance of Black culture, of American history. And so there is a curriculum element to this. And then it is really about part of the education that we receive is to learn how to undo systems. And so we should be in training teachers, not just sort of the nuts and bolts of math education, history education, civics education. And by the way, civics education, we need to beef that up. There's way too much emphasis on writing and arithmetic, with that reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we need to train teachers in particular how to break down systems change. And that's just, two things I think that are essential to changing hearts and minds, because I think now people are aware of the outcomes. They see the outcomes, but they don't know how they're created. And so I think the next step is to really undo how we are taught in general and for everyone, and that will help lead to changes.
So that, you know, I can't agree anymore that that history basis is so important. And just so that the audience knows, we're going to get Dr. Elliott back. She is in North Carolina in a spot with bad coverage, but she'll be back. Okay. Dr. Diaz, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm also in agreement with Dr. Perry, and I would just to complement his comments, I would also add that for an educator, if educators haven't taken this last year and completely done a self-reflection and looked in the mirror at their brutal facts and really challenged their thinking, we all need to do it. As you know, what is our unacceptable inequities? What are we accepting or not accepting as an inequity in our sphere of influence? It's an opportunity for educators from the moment, you know, to make it really practical, from a moment a family, a student walks into our buildings. And I was, prior to coming to the foundation, I was an educator in a district in Michigan and did some turnaround work. And so every moment that a family is in our building matters. So when they're registering their family, if it's an undocumented, non-English speaking family, and that enrollment process could be very different based on the individual that is helping them enroll in the school, right? As something as simple as demanding that they write down a social security number when we know that there's a little box that you just check not applicable or do not have one, and they can continue to, you know, enroll their child. But these little steps can create either miserable and humiliating experiences for children and families, or we can create this sense of shared humanity, because we have established in this country a hierarchy, in most countries, a hierarchy of humanity and human value. And so these are the opportunities that can come to life when we as educators commit to being anti-racist, right? Or whether it's a cultural sensitivity component. If a family, because of religious beliefs or otherwise, does not believe in a holiday or a big celebration like Halloween, for example, what do we do as educators to be able to create the space for them to ensure that we value them, they feel belonged, and we commit as an educational system to be able to have the practices and policies in place to ensure that we can accommodate all families, all children, no matter where they come from, or families that don't have particular restrictions with their diet. How do we accommodate them? You know, families that fast, even in elementary schools during a particular period of time. What do we believe or tell ourselves as educators that this family is abusing this child because they believe in fasting? Like these types of cultural sensitivities, as well as anti-racist commitments in the classroom with curriculum and with our practices. Every little interaction with a child, a student, a family matters, and it should be reflective of our belief system and how we react to inequities, and how can we as individuals make a difference in our environments is a really important question to ask ourselves.
Yeah,
You
that's
know, can I just add to that? And there, with that said, I think there are some real systems we need to disrupt immediately. the way we discipline children has to change
Yes.
because it is racially driven. We see it in the data. We don't trust students. That must change at a systems level. The way we discipline children. Another thing that has to change, if you really respect parents and children, we've got to change our relationship to data, because we use testing as a way to punish schools, to punish teachers, to punish students. Data should be used to learn about the conditions. You change the overall change condition, but now we use data almost as a weapon, particularly during the reform wars. Testing was used as a way to punish districts. And that's not, and typically Black districts. And then there's, it goes without saying, the way we finance schools is inherently problematic. There are other ways to change the way we finance schools. Maryland is undergoing a process, because of COVID. I'm not sure where we're headed, but before COVID, the Maryland legislature was pressed to do the Kerwin Commission to add, what was it? I always get this number wrong. Hundreds of millions of dollars more, committed to $100 million more for education and to create a more equitable system. We really do need to create a different financing structure, probably similar to what we see in healthcare, where the state gets a certain amount of money and they distribute those funds based on equity, not based upon how much your homes are valued in a neighborhood. And so there is like some very concrete systems that if we don't change them, it's going to be hard to really be anti-racist, because if you don't change the systems, you only have so many places to go for change. And that ultimately leads to blaming children and parents and or school boards, and not looking at the root causes. So, but it goes to what Dr. Diaz is saying. We got to figure out ways to really respect children and families, but that respect needs to really show up in systems. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think, this is very powerful, because what you're saying, both of you are saying in many ways, is that for an anti-racist, for us to really build and scale anti-racism throughout, the whole system has to change. It can't be one teacher at a time or one classroom. Because as you both were talking, I was thinking about, if I'm an anti-racist teacher, educator, and I'm changing policies in my classroom, but then my students still have to go to recess. They still have to go to the lunchroom. The parents are still, coming up against all these other practices that are very racist in their, in the idea structure. It's still defeating the purpose. So, if you really think about this, that we're talking about anti-racism in K-12 education, we're talking about the entire all of our systems that hold up our education practice.
Dr. Holcomb, this is Brenda. I'm back. I apologize. Can you hear me? Yeah.
We can hear you, but not see. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
If you don't mind, let me keep my camera off for a minute. And I do apologize. Like, I'm going to tell you one piece of things, we certainly have to think about is access to internet, right?
Yes.
And I'm experiencing that as I'm down in North Carolina helping my sister who's had surgery. But I want to just say that I agree. Like, we have to disrupt the entire system. Like, the system is getting the results that it was created to get. And there is a need for disruption of the entire system. However, I do want to encourage individual action. I do think it's important that, wherever you are, if you think about your circle of influence, that you implement anti-racist work wherever you are. So if you're just a teacher and you think all I can influence is my classroom, you should influence your classroom. If you are the principal and you think what you can influence is the school, you should influence the school. If you're the central office staff member and you can influence the curriculum only, you should influence the curriculum only. I do believe school districts that will make the most progress will be those that can have strategic collective action at every level in their organization. Like that to me is the big win, but I don't think people should wait until the whole system is working to do what you can. Even the one classroom teacher that chooses to be a disruptor and a warm demander in her classroom and ensure that children of color are seen, valued, that their narratives are centered, that they have a access to an education and a curriculum that is rigorous and includes them, that centers them. That teacher should do that, and we want to see more of that. So, if we think about, we are fighting against 400 years, if not 600 years of racism, it's not going to get undone in the next 10 years. And so we want to encourage more people to push hard against those systems and structures. And each year in DCPS, we are doing more work to build the mindsets and capacities of everyone in this organization to push on that work. We are implementing new strategies and new policies every year. So I don't think you can wait until one thing is fixed. You've just got to continue to push in at every level that you can. So I'm not sure if I caught the first part of the conversation, but that's something I just thought was important to say. If you are that one teacher in your building that's working to implement your support students from an anti-racist lens, please continue to do that hard work. That work is necessary. Don't wait. Yeah. Don't wait for the system to change. Change the system.
Right. You're absolutely right. And thank you for that, Bren. We're happy to have you back. And guess that's a good segue too, as we talk about re-entering buildings again after the pandemic, which is on everyone's minds right now. I refuse to call it school reopening. School didn't stop. So we're just re-entering buildings. But what do you think? We're hearing all about language loss, and we need high dosage tutoring and all of these, people are responding, educators are responding to post-pandemic times. What are your anticipations within the context of anti-racism? I mean, how do you see this playing out with that lens on?
Yeah, I'll be happy to start. I would say, first of all, we know that this pandemic has impacted children of color more severely and differently as a whole, not all of them, but as a whole, compared to their white peers. Their families were most likely to had to continue as essential workers. They were most likely not to have all of the support at home, including access to internet and other resources. Not all Black children, but Black children were disproportionately impacted. So as we're coming into recovery and rebuilding, we have to take those things in consideration, that in a number of ways, gaps have been widened. I mean, that's just the reality that we're facing. And so we also have to take into consideration that this has not been one pandemic, but two. It has been dual pandemics. One, a global health emergency, and number two, increases in racism, racial violence that, have been traumatizing to Black people and Black children. And so as we think about education on the other side of this, those are two things that we have to keep in mind, both the disproportionate impact of the health pandemic to children of color, but also this significant impact of these incidents of racism and racial violence, police station violence on television, all those things that we see, and they have to be central to our recovery. So in DCPS, I'll mention a couple of things we've done. One is to really think about trauma responsive practices and centering the needs of the whole child, so that as we think about education moving forward, we're thinking more than just about the academic gaps, but we're thinking about how do we create the conditions for learning where all young people feel valued or able to thrive. How are we focused on creating relationships and agency for voice, for different voices? I heard some great comments from Dr. Diaz earlier when she talked about like centering the narratives of children of color. We are doing some incredible work around revisioning school security, where last year, more than $4 million of our budget was reinvested out of security to support emotional well-being in student engagement. This year, probably will reinvest a similar amount, giving young people opportunities to tell us like what is required for us to create schools that you feel valued and welcome and supported. And we are centering the voices of Black males who disproportionately have those negative interactions with police and our school security, as we think about those ways that we're revisioning that part of our schools. And I'll stop there so others can comment.
Great. Yeah, I mean, those are all wonderful ways that that DCPS is really focusing on the whole child and community-based work. I'm gonna shift gears because we could do this for like 2 or 3 hours. I mean, this is a wonderful conversation, but we only have an hour. We have a few questions that some of our audience put out there. So I'm gonna start asking those questions because they are related to what we were just talking about. This is one question about looking at homelessness. And could you talk a little bit about interactions between racism and homelessness, housing insecurity of students?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly, the moratoriums on housing, they're eventually going to end. And we've already also seen pressure from landlords, especially evicting Black and brown families at incredible rates. And so not only are we experiencing homelessness epidemic now, it's probably going to get worse once these temporary measures go away. And so we need to be prepared for that. And this is why we really do need to think about systems. Schools can't do everything. And yes, we can set up, and there are many school districts across the country that have set up arrangements with housing authorities and the like to make sure that students have housing. However, kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. And if those communities aren't whole, the schools are just going to be inundated with these problems. And this is something I want to direct to folks in ed leadership, that we're always talking about what to do for the school. We need to look beyond the school at times and look at the systems that also impact education. I can't say there's enough that if you're only focused on the school, you're going to miss all these issues that enter the school. So if you're a systems thinker, systems leader, that's where you can find solutions. But we're going to see a wave of children who've had multiple addresses, have been bed surfing. Some are just, in some cases, living in a car and in the street. And we're going to see certainly increases over the next few months, and we just need to be prepared for that. But again, I think an anti-racist approach looks at structural solutions, not just dealing with the acute emergency.
I would say both. The structure has to happen. There is not a single community or district within a community where the community cannot thrive the district, and those children in that district are not thriving also. And so there is the correlation. I would say yes to the structure. We have to have partnerships with school systems that go beyond the subject matter of the 4 R's, but we need to absolutely make a connection to those community resources that support the entire family. Seeing the family as whole includes housing. And when we have students that are homeless, we have to consider how do we as a district and our policies support this family in its entirety. So if that means that our transportation system has to cross a district border to pick up a student so that they can continue to maintain at least a regular structure and routine in their life, that matters. If we can provide some grace to that family and that student, and when they arrive late because of the transportation issues or because of their homelessness, and not just constantly give them demerits or detentions, or because they're late because of their homelessness, and all of a sudden they get 5 detentions, so now they get a suspension, and that's the process. That's our system that we create. We're individuals within this institution that create these systems. But what I want to challenge any educator that's listening to us today is you can have a role in changing that system, and to be able to accommodate the needs of that family or that student based on what makes sense when we think about this concept of shared humanity and what can we do to support the student. So it's an individual that's, whether it's a principal or a teacher that's saying, oh honey, you need some breakfast, you haven't had breakfast, let's get you breakfast, even though the breakfast line is closed, that the secretary and the lunch staff and the teacher and all of these individuals are saying, we're going to make sure that this homeless child is taken care of, not just their learning, but every factor of their being. And then we're also connecting the school with the community systems that can help us get this family to a safe home and a long, sustainable, safe future for that family. It's a both and.
Yeah. Another one of those systems, since you're talking about systems, is discipline, which you've referred to, all of you have referred to discipline policies. There's a question out there about restorative practices, and how do you see those practices being integrated into current systems? Do you see that as being at a larger level? Do you see that as being a response or an anti-racist approach using restorative justice?
I'll say that many of the restorative practices that we've seen, they've had mixed results. But I say that it's better to keep a kid in school with the restorative practices than to suspend or expel a children. I mean, and this, it goes without saying, but we're finally starting to realize it, that suspending or expelling a kid may provide some temporary relief to an individual classroom teacher, but it's horrible for the student and it's horrible for the community. And so that little temporary relief you get comes back to you later. And so it's just better to establish practices, norms that keep students in school. And and that's where the restorative practices are promising, because they're school-based. And so yeah, but again, I often, as a former school leader, I remember so many conflicts that occurred actually started out of the school. And it's because children don't have adequate recreational activities, adequate transportation, and then all that comes to a head in school. Yeah. And so for me, it's like restorative practices work, but they're not a panacea to the deeper problem.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, Dr. Perry, is we have to kind of take a step back. Restorative practices can work. I agree, but I think we have to look back at and challenge the white dominant culture in our school systems that expect certain behaviors from certain students. And we have normalized certain behaviors, and that's where the discipline, the school discipline has to be, I think, radically shifted, because we have, in most places, have toxic environments for children. And then we're trying to, I think that we're trying to shift, right? The challenge is that we have assimilated or tried to assimilate certain populations into this white dominant culture. Restorative practices have an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity gap that we can address with restorative practice, but we also have to analyze and the structures that in the cultures that have existed in the discipline policies that also need to be radically shifted. So if we're going to bring in restorative practices, with the places where I think we've seen that have challenged with restorative practices are where we are trying to create a Band-Aid, put a Band-Aid on a situation, but we haven't removed those structures of that white dominancy in that school. And so the restorative practices are only a piece of the pie, but the whole pie hasn't been reviewed and analyzed and radically changed. When we do that, then the restorative practices, I think, are a really valuable practice.
Great. So once again, it's a part of a larger system, but the key is to keep kids in school. I don't know, Dr. Elliott, are you?
I would love to. Oh, just, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
So we added 2 restorative justice specialists to our central office team to help us lean more deeply in this work. And so I agree with what I'm hearing from my colleagues, and certainly am thinking just from their comments of ways that we might even push ourselves further. The thing that I feel is most valued around the restorative practices work is that we're starting to have conversations about what happened to the student that led them to that behavior. Oftentimes in school discipline, we're giving people consequences for a behavior without doing some digging to understand why does that young person feel like that is the way they would handle that particular conflict or that particular situation. So for me, with restorative justice, we're not just talking about how we repair the harm, but we're talking about how do we restore children to their school or to their community. So the person who may have committed the harm, how do we restore them to the community? So restorative practices allows us to get to deeper conversations that hopefully unearth the things around the white dominant culture that shows up, the systems and structures that cause some kids to feel like they're welcomed and included and loved and have a sense of belonging in their community or their school, and cause other kids to feel like I'm not expected to succeed here, that I'm invisible here, or that I'm criminalized here. So restorative practices allows you to start unearthing the root causes of those incidents and behaviors that are happening, and to start actually having real dialogue about what is creating these conditions in our school that cause some students to feel valued and supported and appreciated and nurtured, and others to not feel that way, and therefore results in some of the behaviors we have. I am proud to say that in DCPS, even before the pandemic. Of course, we're not suspending kids right now because no one, most of our kids are not in school. But even before this, we'd had a 4-year trend of reducing the use of what we call exclusionary practices. I think that's the trend across the nation, actually, of actually reducing that. What we are working to do more of is thinking about how do we, build our adults skills. So, how do we help our adults intervene in situations that they are not acting in what I would consider to be a racist manner? Because a lot of times with our incidents that we see is a teacher perception of a behavior being violent or out of code. And when we have to do that intentional work around mindsets of teachers so that their view of Black children is not negative. Like you see all the research that says even in the preschool and earlier age that adults or others are more likely to think a Black kid is, or even at the preschool level, is dangerous or violent. So we have to do that mindset shift work so that our adults that we have that are interacting with our children actually have that, they don't have a biased view of young people and their behavior. So I think that is essential, but those conversations and restorative practices, so we can hear from kids. I think I'll say finally, the most important thing that I've seen in the restorative practice is that we can hear from children and they can tell us what their experience is in schools. And for some kids, it's painful how they feel like they are viewed in their schools. And that can cause a school community to really shift and take notice of how young people feel as part of that community.
And if I can just add one thing to that, that when I was ran a charter network in New Orleans, we were entertaining restorative justice practices, and I started asking questions of our teachers and the organization that implemented them. And it became clear that I wanted teachers to have the freedom to have that same kind of dialogue. I felt like we didn't need a pull-out system, that the rich dialogue that should be occurring with students between this teacher and the student, they weren't happening. There was so much pressure to follow a curriculum or to follow or to meet a certain test threshold that teachers actually weren't having the kind of interactions that mitigate some kind of explosive event. And so part of my, it's not a hesitancy, but again, I always ask why, what's going on here? And sometimes there were opportunities for a teacher just to have a good conversation, but the daily rigors would not allow for it to occur. And so my only reservation for restorative justice is don't erode the power of the teacher-student relationship. It should be there. It's essential. And that's where you're going to get the most out of interaction right then and there. And so if you're not able to do that, we need to look why, or ask why isn't it occurring?
Yeah, and that's a really, as we continue to talk about teacher preparation, there's a question about pre-service training, the training around building relationships with students, teachers, having some training or, that time even within the pre-service experience on that, because all the research shows that relationship is paramount. And the notion of restorative justice practices is another area of teacher training. You kind of get it if there's a faculty member that gets it, or you might not. So, as we continue to talk about anti-racism, this need for understanding of what are those skills that beginning teachers need to be successful in the context of what we've been talking about today is really important. like I said, we could go another hour. We're getting a stream of questions, loads of them, which maybe what we can do is I'll share them with the panelists, and we can, if you can jot down some answers, really quick questions, because we have questions about the differences between urban schools and rural schools, which I think is a valid question. Questions around other policies and about your own work experiences. I apologize that we don't have more time. That's a regret. But you have 1 minute, each of you, to just sort of lay out possible hints or tips or for our aspiring educators out there about their future practices, and from your own perch, because all three of you are in different settings, different places. So let's start with Dr. Diaz, if you a minute to kind of give the group some parting remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think what motivates me is knowing that there are so many structures that need transformation for our children and communities. It is not okay, for example, to suspend a 3 or 4-year-old or arrest a 6 or 7-year-old because they had a temper tantrum. That's motivation for me to be able to say we can help. So the Kellogg Foundation supports and works with organizations that are putting a stop to these harmful practices that don't make sense. A few that I would recommend: Teaching for Change, the Teaching Well, as 2 examples. That it's because of the racial inequities, injustices, and racism that this kind of harmful action that we've talked about today and these structural behaviors is tolerated, but should not be. So I am motivated to take bold, courageous steps to disrupt these types of systems so that we can protect children and make sure that families are thriving. I'm happy to be a resource to anybody that would want more of a conversation. And thank you for the time that you've given us so far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diaz. Dr. Perry.
Yeah, I'm going to provide a little curricula recommendation. I really want to see history as well as civics education overhauled. If we didn't learn from the January 6th, my son is the January 6th insurrection. If we didn't learn that we need a change in civics education, we're never going to learn. And so for me, it's about reforming civics education and history. And this is a DCPS student right here.
And tell your son he's quite okay. He's quite okay. And Dr. Elliott.
Yeah, and I think he is just so creative and curious, and upset that he's not part of this panel discussion, Dad.
Yeah, we gotta have him on the next one.
We should have had him on the panel. Yes, so cute. Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing I would certainly recommend people to do is dig in and prepare yourself to be an anti-racist educator. Lean in hard. This is the time. Our kids deserve it. Our nation is ready for it. I would just encourage people to dig in. DC Public Schools launched our own anti-racist educator university in January, and we're providing monthly opportunities for our teachers to come together to build their knowledge, skills, and capacity to do this work. We are having national speakers come in and talk with them, and then providing them opportunities for professional learning communities to really dig in with like-minded educators to build their skill sets. So I just really recommend and encourage school districts and individual schools to create the space for this and to demand this. Our children absolutely deserve it. We as a nation, when we look at the when we look at the achievement gap, we can see that for the past 50 years, it has been relatively unchanged. And as a nation, we forego trillions of dollars that could be contributing to our economics by not ensuring that Black and Brown children excel and at the same level as their white peers in our schools. So it is both a moral imperative and a fiscal imperative for this nation that the underdeveloped talents of our Black and brown children are invested in. They just deserve it, and we are obligated. We are morally obligated to do this work. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with these great leaders who are leaning in hard, and to be a partner with AU and just really encourage people to help us as that we all, lean into live out the true values that are stated in our nation. And give everybody access to equal opportunities.
Thank you. And that's a great note to end. I wish I could bottle up all of your passion and brilliance and energy all into a bottle and then sprinkle it over everywhere. You all are just fantastic. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us today, and our audience for tuning in. Really appreciate it, and see you next time at our Big Ideas in Education. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Have a great day.
Thank